How many possible permutations are there on a Rubik's Cube? How did the Rubik's Cube come out of the Soviet bloc before even Tetris did? And did the creator get rich off of his investment or not? It's the 50th anniversary of its creation, so today we're looking at the history of the Rubik's Cube. Welcome to another episode of Rad History, recounting the stories from the 80s and 90s, the last time things were relatively normal and chill. I'm Brian McCullough. In 1974, in a modest apartment in Budapest, Hungary, a young architecture professor named Ernő Rubik was pondering a problem. He taught his students about spatial relationships and geometric structures, but he found himself searching for a better way to demonstrate how individual pieces could move independently without the entire structure falling apart. Little did he know that his solution would become one of the most beloved and influential puzzles in human history. Ernő Rubik was born in Budapest on July 13th, 1944, during the tumultuous final year of World War II. His arrival into the world came at a time when his country was caught between Nazi occupation and advancing Soviet forces. His father was a highly regarded aircraft engineer who specialized in the design of gliders. His mother was a poet and artist who worked as a literature teacher. Growing up in Soviet-controlled Hungary, young Ernő developed a fascinating blend of his parents' interests. From his father, he inherited a deep appreciation for mechanical problems and three-dimensional thinking. His mother's artistic influence nurtured his creative side and his appreciation for beauty in design. The combination would later prove crucial in his most famous invention. Rubik's childhood was marked by curiosity and a love for solving puzzles. He spent countless hours in his father's workshop learning about mechanical principles and developing spatial awareness through hands-on experience with tools and materials. After completing his secondary education, Rubik enrolled at the Budapest University of Technology and Economics. He studied architecture and graduated in 1967. His choice of architecture as a profession was key. Obviously, it combined his interest in art, design, and structural engineering. Following graduation, Rubik remained in academia, taking a position as a professor at the Budapest College of Applied Arts, now called Moholy Nagy University of Art and Design. Here he taught interior design and worked in the geometry department, focusing on the development of teaching materials and visual aids for students learning about complex geometric principles. This time in his life was crucial in developing his teaching philosophy. Rubik believed strongly in the power of learning through hands-on experience and physical manipulation of objects. He often created his own teaching tools when existing materials proved inadequate for explaining complex spatial concepts to his students. And so, one day, working with blocks of wood and rubber bands in his mother's apartment, Rubik created the first prototype of what would later be known as the Rubik's Cube. The initial design was rough, wooden blocks held together by rubber bands, screws, and paper clips. The first prototype didn't even have colored stickers. Rubik marked the sides with different colored paper attached with paper clips, as he was just trying to demonstrate structural movement. But the fundamental mechanism was revolutionary. It was a structure that could twist and turn while remaining intact, with each face capable of rotating independently. Rubik's original goal wasn't to create a puzzle. He was more interested in solving the structural problem of moving parts independently without the whole mechanism falling apart. It wasn't until he scrambled his creation for the first time that he realized he had inadvertently created a fiendishly difficult puzzle. As he later recalled, "It was wonderful to see how after only a few turns the colors became mixed, apparently in random fashion. It was tremendously satisfying to watch this color parade, like after a nice walk. When you have seen many lovely sights, you decide to go home. After a while, I decided it was time to go home. Let us put the cubes back in order." And it was at that moment that I came face to face with the big challenge. What is the way home? The first person to solve the cube was, of course, its inventor, Rubik himself. But this was no simple task. Without any precedent, without any solving methods or best practices to fall back on, Rubik spent over a month working on returning his creation to its original state. This period of frustration and eventual triumph would later be experienced by millions of people around the world who played with his invention. After solving the puzzle himself, Rubik knew he had created something special, even if as a teaching tool alone and not a toy, he wanted other people to have access to it. But getting it to market in communist Hungary in the 1970s was no simple task. He applied for a Hungarian patent in 1977, and after navigating the bureaucratic challenges of the time, his invention began being produced by a small Hungarian cooperative called Polytechnica. The early cubes were sold in Hungarian toy shops under the name Magic Cube. They were built by hand, with each cube taking several hours to assemble. The initial production run was small, with only a few thousand cubes made. The cube's journey to global phenomenon began when it caught the attention of Tom Kramer, a Hungarian-born toy expert living in London. Kramer discovered the cube at the Nuremberg Toy Fair in 1979 and immediately recognized its potential. He negotiated the worldwide rights and licensed it to a company called Ideal Toys. In 1980, Ideal Toy Company flew Rubik to a New York toy fair. Though he wasn't exactly a born salesman, being a reserved architecture professor who still struggled with English, the company needed to prove that someone actually could solve the puzzle. So Rubik was their proof of concept, or at least their proof of solving. Ideal Toys renamed the toy Rubik's Cube and began mass production that same year. The first mass-produced cubes had a serious design flaw. They would often fall apart after extensive use, and this led to the creation of an underground cube repair industry in the early 1980s. But the marketing campaign for the toy was brilliant in its simplicity. They sent cubes to influential mathematicians, scientists, and celebrities, creating buzz through word of mouth. They also emphasized the mind-boggling mathematics behind the puzzle. A standard 3x3 Rubik's Cube has 3 quintillion solutions. Or, if you want me to actually spell that out for you, grab a pen. There are 43, 252, 003, 274, 489, 856, 000 possible combinations. Yet there's only one solution. That number of possible combinations is larger than the number of grains of sand on Earth or the number of stars in the observable universe. The timing for the Rubik's Cube was perfect. The 1980s were dawning, and the world was ready for an intellectual toy that combined mathematics, art, and play. The Rubik's Cube became more than a puzzle. It became a symbol of intelligence and persistence, a status symbol that said, "I can solve this." The mathematics and group theory underlying the Rubik's Cube fascinated academics and enthusiasts alike. The cube demonstrated complex mathematical concepts in a tangible way, from permutation groups to algorithms. Mathematicians studied its properties, developing optimal solution methods and proving theoretical limits on the number of moves needed to solve any scrambled cube, known as the God's number. More on that in a second. The cube also became a valuable tool in computer science, with researchers using it to study algorithmic complexity and artificial intelligence. The challenge of creating programs that could solve the cube efficiently helped advance the field of computer problem solving. By 1981, Ideal Toys was selling the cube at a rate of 1 million per month. At its peak, stores couldn't keep the puzzle in stock, with some reporting waiting lists and customers fighting over new shipments. The cube dominated media coverage in ways unprecedented for a puzzle toy. Major magazines like Time and Newsweek featured it on their covers. Television shows regularly included segments about the cube, from news reports about its popularity to game shows featuring speed cubing competitions. More on that in a second as well. The puzzle even inspired its own Saturday morning cartoon, which aired on ABC in 1983, called Rubik the Amazing Cube. The cube became a status symbol among celebrities and intellectuals. Famous figures like Stanley Kubrick, Kurt Vonnegut, and Andy Warhol were photographed with their cubes. Politicians used the cube as a prop to appear intelligent and problem-solving oriented. Even the Queen of England, Elizabeth II, was reportedly fascinated by it. Universities began offering courses analyzing the cube's mathematical properties. Scientific papers were published about its group theory implications. Solution books became bestsellers, with one of them written by a teenager at the time named Patrick Bossert, called You Can Do the Cube, sold over 1.5 million copies. The cube's success spawned countless knockoffs and variations. Some estimates suggest that during the peak of the craze, counterfeit cubes outsold genuine Rubik's cubes by a significant margin. This led to numerous legal battles and international copyright disputes. The scientist Douglas Hofstadter called it much more than a puzzle. Quote, "It is an ingenious mechanical invention, a pastime, a learning tool, a source of metaphors and inspiration." By 1982, more than 100 million cubes had been sold worldwide. Initially, Rubik himself received no salary from the toy manufacturer, and his royalty payments were slow to materialize. He continued living modestly on his $200 monthly teaching income. People began whispering that he had either become Hungary's wealthiest citizen or had been swindled out of his fortune by dubious associates, but both claims were false. Rubik would eventually become the first self-made millionaire from the communist bloc, though much of his wealth was initially controlled by the Hungarian state. And yes, like many 80s fads, the faddish energy eventually waned. By the mid-1980s, sales had dropped significantly, and many predicted the cube would become just another forgotten toy. What kept the cube alive in popular imagination was its original selling point. How do you solve this thing? The 1982 World Championship in Budapest was a landmark event. 19 countries sent their best cubers to compete. The winner, Min Tai from the United States, solved the cube in 22.95 seconds, establishing the first official world record. The event received global media coverage and legitimized speed cubing as a competitive pursuit that continues to this day. The modern speed cubing scene is a far cry from that first one back in 1982. Today's top solvers can routinely complete the cube in under 10 seconds, with the current world record standing at an almost unbelievable 3.47 seconds. Competitions are held regularly around the world with events for different cube sizes, from 2x2 to 7x7, solving with one hand, solving blindfold, and more. There are now more than 1,000 speed cubing competitions every year. The technology of the cube itself has also evolved significantly. Modern speed cubes are precisely engineered with specialized mechanisms and high-quality plastics, allowing for smoother, faster solving. Magnetic cubes have become standard in competition, with magnets helping to align the layers and provide tactile feedback during solving. If you're interested in learning how to solve a Rubik's Cube yourself, there's actually at this point 50 years of theory and philosophy behind how to do this. The mathematics of the cube is actually based on something called group theory, but don't worry, you don't actually need to understand that to solve it. What you need to know is that every move you make on the cube is reversible, and combining different sequences of moves, called algorithms, can move pieces where you want them while leaving other pieces unchanged. It's all about the concept of layers. This was first developed by David Singmaster in 1981, quoting Wikipedia. The solution involves solving the cube layer by layer, in which one layer, designated the top, is solved first, followed by the middle layer, and then the final and bottom layer. After sufficient practice, solving the cube layer by layer can be done in under 1 minute. Other general solutions include corners first methods or combinations of several other methods, end quote. The key thing to understand is that you're not trying to solve the whole cube at once. You're solving it layer by layer. And within each layer, piece by piece, it's like building a house. You start with the foundation layer first, then the walls as the middle layer, and finally the roof as the last layer. The magic happens, though, again, through algorithms, not necessarily in the modern computer science or social media sense of that word. Cubers think of solving algorithms as a term for specific sequences of moves that have predictable effects. The simplest might be just 4 to 5 moves, while more complex ones can be 10 plus. These algorithms are like recipes. You don't need to understand exactly why they work, just that if you follow the steps, you'll get the desired result. Wikipedia again. This terminology is derived from the mathematical use of algorithms, meaning a list of well-defined instructions for performing a task from a given initial state, through well-defined successive states to a desired end state. Each method of solving the cube employs its own set of algorithms, together with descriptions of what effect the algorithm has and when it can be used to bring the cube closer to being solved. Many algorithms are designed to transform only a small part of the cube without interfering with other parts that have already been solved, so that they can be applied repeatedly to different parts of the cube until the whole is solved. For example, there are well-known algorithms for cycling 3 corners without changing the rest of the puzzle, or flipping the orientation of a pair of edges while leaving the others intact, end quote. What makes the cube seem impossible at first is that 43 quintillion possible positions number. But you don't need to understand all the possibilities. You just need to know maybe 5 to 7 basic algorithms to solve it reliably and repeatedly. The real trick isn't in the math, it's in the approach. Break down a seemingly impossible task into small manageable steps, and suddenly it becomes achievable. That's why the Rubik's Cube is such a great puzzle. It teaches us that complex problems can be solved through simple, methodical approaches. As mentioned back in 2020, a team of researchers proved that the so-called God's number for the Rubik's Cube is 20. That means that any initial configuration of the cube, no matter how much you mix it up, can be solved in 20 moves or less. Technically, mathematically. At this point, well north of 250 million cubes have sold globally. But remember, there are tons of knockoffs as well, so the number of cubes in people's hands is probably well north of that. For Ernő Rubik, who still lives in Budapest, the success of his cube has been both gratifying and somewhat overwhelming. He has always maintained a modest perspective on his invention, viewing it as a tool for teaching and learning rather than just a toy. In his words, the cube has been an inspiration to creativity, a challenge to intelligence, and a demonstration that things are not always what they seem. When the rumors of the vast fortune he might have created by the cube began to circulate, Rubik himself pulled back from the limelight. The cube loves attention. I don't. He is eager to interact with everyone. I sometimes find this a bit difficult. He's quite ambitious. I am less so, Rubik wrote in an autobiography a few years ago. I'm not the person who loves to be in the spotlight, and so on and so forth, he told the New York Times in 2020. That kind of success is like a fever. A high fever can be very dangerous. It's not reality, end quote. But he still plays with his invention himself, even if he would come nowhere close to the current speed records. He has run a design studio in Hungary and still develops his own puzzles and games. Aside from being a toy icon of the 80s and 90s, right up there with Pac-Man and Pokemon and Beanie Babies, I would make the argument that the Rubik's Cube was a key milestone to the gaming ecosystem we have now, the whole gaming industry. Solo gameplay has been around forever, as have puzzle games going back to crosswords and solitaire and others, but I'm saying that the Rubik's Cube, being a solo puzzle game that was also portable, you could put it in your pocket, is part of a direct gaming legacy of puzzle manipulation, of spatial solving, of mathematical gaming, but crucially, of mobile gaming that is part of a lineage that includes Tetris on things like the Game Boy, that leads us directly to the mobile gaming on our smartphones. That includes all of us tapping out Candy Crush and Royal Match and things like that endlessly. Thanks for joining me for another episode of Rad History. If you've had fun, please like and subscribe. And that includes if you are listening to this on a podcast app. Hit subscribe for new nuggets of 80s, 90s history in your ears every week. Until then, yo homes, smell you later.